Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our event with our guest speaker, Professor Katrina Wyman from New York University. I'm Oben Zaou, and I'm delighted to say a few words about our program funded by the European Commission through the H2020 and Marie Curie Actions. So this month, our series will also feature two different speakers, namely Professor Kerry Koulienis from the University of Pennsylvania, and that will be on June the 9th. And we'll also have Professor Don Elliott from Yale University, and that will be on June the 23rd. Please visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/inner-center, where you will find the upcoming events in the series, but also the great lineup of our past speakers. Feel free to use the chat box for your questions. And in due course, we will be displaying the CLE credit slides. I'll now turn it over to Professor Gina Warren, co-director of the Inner Center and our chair this morning.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. This is fantastic. I see we have 26 people on, so that's wonderful. Thank you all for joining us. I'm excited about today's talk. Today we welcome Professor Katrina Wyman. Professor Wyman is the Sarah Herring Soren Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law, where she teaches and researches in the area of property, urban environmental law, and natural resources law, among other things. She's the Deputy Faculty Director of the NYU Environmental Energy Land Use Law Center, as well as the Faculty Director of their LLM program in environmental and energy law. Her recent research is addressing a range of topics, including the role of cities in environmental law, both domestically and internationally, and climate change, comprehensive legal climate change work, which she'll be presenting today. So in addition to being a prolific scholar, Professor Wyman is also an amazing teacher. In 2020, she received an award for her teaching, and she has a BA, an MA, and an LLB from the University of Toronto and an LLM from Yale. So today we're going to hear her most recent research on the US struggle to establish a comprehensive legal framework to address climate change. So please feel free to put questions in the chat box. What we'll do is we'll have Professor Wyman will present for some time, and then we will stop and have questions, and we can have it interactive to a degree, but if you could put them in questions in the chat box, that would be great as we go. So I will turn it over to you, and we will get moving in that right direction.
Great. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And I'm going to now share my screen. Okay. Let's just move to start the slides. Okay. So thank you again. And thanks to everybody who's joined. So in the past several years, I've become very interested in what local governments can do in the environmental law and policy space, and worked on a lot of local environmental law issues with my colleague at NYU, Danielle Spiegelfeld. And one thing that's really struck me is that to a notable extent, US cities have really been left to their own devices to try to reduce their GHG emissions and to adapt to climate change, at least until recently. And this is very paradoxical because in the 1970s, as I'm sure most of the people most of the people online know, the federal government really became the preeminent environmental regulator in the country to address air and water pollution in large measure because cities and states were seen as incapable of addressing the nation's environmental challenges. And yet here we are today, 5 decades later, basically leaving these lower levels of government to address the preeminent environmental challenge of our times. So today I want to talk about a question that has really puzzled me as I've been working on local environmental law, which is, Why has the US had such difficulty implementing a comprehensive national framework to address climate change, given that the federal government really has had such a significant role in environmental law for 5 decades now? And I think this is a very topical question, obviously, given that President Biden came into office with very aggressive climate goals. And while he's had some successes, he's had real difficulty as well, as we all know. His Build Back Better legislation with tax credits for clean energy has been blocked in the Senate, and his ability to use regulatory authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate power plant emissions may be limited by the Supreme Court in a decision that we're all waiting for in West Virginia versus EPA. Okay, so I'm really in the early stages of thinking about this question about why the US has struggled so much. And I'm going to acknowledge up front that my thoughts really draw heavily on the work of political scientist Matto Mildenberger at UC Santa Barbara in his 2020 book, Carbon Captured. And part of what I'd like to do today, if we have time, is to kind of hear people's reactions to some some of Mildenberger's hypotheses. Okay, so with that in mind, I kind of have 4 parts to the presentation today. First of all, I want to just start off by talking about what might a comprehensive mitigation policy actually include. I'm saying here the US has struggled to adopt such a policy. So what might actually such a policy look like? And again, I'm emphasizing here, I'm just talking about mitigation, setting aside the adaptation issues for this presentation. Secondly, I want to just briefly talk about, well, how far is the US actually from having such a comprehensive policy? And then look to some of the potential explanations for this struggle that the US has had in developing this national policy, and then look to some of the opportunities suggested by the political science literature for potentially advancing the goal of developing a national policy. Okay, so what might a comprehensive policy framework actually look like? So one way of getting at this question is to think about, well, what are the main sources of GHG emissions in the US right now? And so you can think about, probably many people have seen this graph, highlighting the 5 sectors that are main contributors to GHG emissions, with transportation number 1, electricity number 2, industry number 3, buildings number 4, and agriculture number 5. So one way of thinking about what a comprehensive strategy would look like is that it would be a 5-sector strategy that really sought to reduce GHG emissions in these 5 sectors. Okay. Another way of looking at what a comprehensive national strategy would look like is to look at what the EU has done. It has a roughly similar sources of emissions profile as the US. And you can see that it has adopted policies for all 5 sectors, okay, at the EU level. So it's been regulating car emissions, fuel emissions, and it's proposing to ban the sale of new fossil fueled cars starting in 2035. It has the EU emissions trading program, which covers electric utilities and industry. It's regulating emissions from buildings, and it's starting to regulate emissions from agriculture as well. Okay, so you can think of that as a comparison. So really, in a way, what I'm sort of asking here in this presentation is, well, why doesn't the US have this kind of 5-sector strategy, okay, or something comparable to it? So just to kind of further stimulate the question, there's this preliminary point about, well, how far is the US from adopting such a comprehensive policy framework, or a 5-sector strategy, as you might think about it? Okay, so this is a very comprehensive, very cluttered slide, but it's a slide I started to do a few years ago with some help from people around here at NYU. Okay, so what does this slide show? It shows basically at the top, sort of the key international milestones in the efforts to reduce GHG emissions. And then below the years, it shows US efforts domestically at the federal level to reduce GHG emissions, okay? And I've got, they're sorted by presidential administration, with the red administrations being the Republican administrations and the blue administrations being the Democratic administrations, okay? So obviously there's a lot of information here. But I'm going to kind of try to highlight three takeaways here from this slide. Okay, so bearing in mind what I said previously, that you could think of a comprehensive national policy framework as having as addressing GHG emissions in 5 sectors. The first takeaway I would suggest from this slide is that the US at the federal level has a kind of strategy, and a fairly enduring strategy, for reducing emissions from the car sector. I'm not saying that that strategy will get us to where we need to be at this point, but that is the one sector where I would say the transportation car sector, I'm using those terms interchangeably, where the US has kind of had an enduring policy approach at the national level. And, you know, not that it's been smooth sailing, but starting with the, you know, the very well-known car rules adopted in the Obama administration, facilitated by the Supreme Court's ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA. You've seen basically some form of regulation of GHG emissions from cars at the federal level. Obviously, in the Trump administration, there were severe efforts to weaken those rules, but you know, the Biden administration has reintroduced those rules, strengthened them a bit. And so that, to a large extent, that is the one sector where you've seen something happen at the federal level. Okay. And I actually, and whereas there is no real regulatory framework for reducing GHG emissions from power plants at the federal level, or really from key industrial sectors, or from agriculture, or from buildings at the federal level. Okay. So it's actually kind of interesting, I think, and perhaps a little bit tangential to my presentation today, but it is interesting to think about, well, why has the US been able to kind of sustain some regulation of GHG emissions from the car sector? And I think you know, you could have various hypotheses, you know, the fact that the federal government, you know, kind of bailed out some of the big automakers in the early Obama administration, the role of California as a backstop to because of California's ability under the Clean Air Act to regulate GHG emissions from cars, assuming it can has a waiver from federal government. So you could think of various sort of, I would say, US focused explanations for the fact that there's some regulation of the car sector emissions. But I also think it's worth thinking about the nature of the car industry. People often talk about globalization as having contributed to climate change. This might be an instance where the global nature of the industry actually may be contributing to the persistence of US regulation. And so just to flip for a second to this slide. So here you see what are the leading markets for the top 3 car manufacturers in the US. And you see that their leading markets are not only in the US, but also in China and Europe, both jurisdictions that have pretty aggressive standards for electrifying vehicles. Okay, by 2035, both of them, well, the EU wants to ban the sale of new gas-fired cars starting in 2035. In China, by 2035, they want all new cars to be new energy cars, half of which would include electric vehicles. So this could be the ability of the US to sustain a regulatory regime in the car sector may be due to some of the characteristics of the car industry, it being a global industry, and the effects of Brussels and Beijing on the car industry. Okay, now a second takeaway, so that's kind of like the positive, one of the positive takeaways here is that, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. One sector has some federal regulation, the cars. A second takeaway I would highlight here, which sort of is embedded in what I was saying about the car sector, is that to the extent that there really has been regulation at the federal level, it's come through regulation as opposed to legislation. Okay, and that regulation was really facilitated, as probably many people on the Zoom know, by Massachusetts versus EPA decision in 2007, you know, reinforcing the authority of EPA to regulate GHG emissions under the Clean Air Act. Of course, we all know that regulation is a very precarious form, a very precarious tool for climate policy. yes, it can be introduced, but it can also be revoked or repealed or relaxed, as many important climate regulations were in the Trump era. And not only can the executive weaken regulation, but Congress can undo regulations, and the courts can also threaten the ability of the regulators to actually regulate. And so I'm sure I'm not alone in waiting with bated breath to see what the Supreme Court is going to do later this term in West Virginia versus EPA. Now, the third takeaway I would highlight from this slide is that while regulation has proven to be the dominant tool for regulating GHG emissions in the US context, this reflects the inability to pass legislation at the federal level to really comprehensively address climate change. But this takeaway here is that it's not like there haven't been real serious efforts over decades now to pass legislation to reduce GHG emissions. And it's interesting when those efforts really date back to the Clinton administration. And it's interesting when you look at the efforts in the Clinton era, then when you look in the efforts at the 2000s, and then you look at the most recent Build Back Better effort, you see really there have been serious proposals for tax in the Clinton administration, emissions trading in the 2000s, and tax credits and spending now in the Biden era. And none of these approaches have yet to succeed. Okay, these are like the three kind of like dominant approaches that economists tend to advocate for dealing with environmental tools, in particular emissions trading or taxes, but also spending recognized as a policy tool. But we have yet to be able to implement these approaches at the federal level through legislation. Okay, now an interesting question is why. Okay, and another interesting point that you can sort of deduce from this slide, or really more from the political science literature, is that the Senate has been the key obstacle. If you look at all these key proposals over time, dating back to the Clinton era, it's consistently been the inability to get legislation through the Senate that's been the key obstacle. Okay, and another kind of related point is that I think there's a tendency, as I'll get to a bit later, to say, well, it's really opposition from Republicans that is blocking climate legislation. Okay, but and of course, there's been a great deal of attention, recently focused on the role of Senator Manchin from West Virginia. But what the history of these legislative efforts suggests is it's not just opposition from Republicans. Okay, and that Joe Manchin is not actually a historical aberration. Okay, and in fact, if the Biden administration fails to pass legislation reducing emissions from the electricity, from the electricity sector, if it fails to pass Build Back Better, it will really be actually the third Democratic presidential administration in a row that came in with control of the House and the Senate, okay, that hasn't been able to use that control to pass climate legislation in its first 2 years in office due to due to opposition in the Senate. Okay, so it's a kind of complicated picture, but you can see, these consistent efforts over time, but inability really to get legislation through, even under Democratic presidential administrations that have control over the House and the Senate. Okay, even with efforts to try all these different policy tools. Okay, now, I don't want to suggest that all is doom and gloom, and I don't want to, overlook what is being done below the federal level at the state and the city level, because obviously a lot is being done. And, this slide kind of highlights how, I've been talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions as a national problem, a national challenge, but you could also break this challenge down, as many are, into state level challenges. And if you do that, you see, as this kind of slide suggests, that about 50% of US GHG emissions come from 10 states, and 75% of GHG emissions come from 22 states. So another way to deal with the issue of GHG emissions, of course, would be to go state by state. And you see some progress has been made by going state by state. 5 of the 10 states that account for 50% of GHG emissions have binding GHG targets, and 10 of the 22 that account for 75% have binding GHG reduction targets. Okay, so some progress is being made, okay, below the national level, okay, and that's worth bearing in mind. Okay. In fact, you might say that the US domestic strategy, which has been to a large extent a bottom-up strategy focused at the state and to a lesser extent the local level, is kind of mirrors the international strategy, which is also a very bottom-up strategy at this particular point in time, relying on initiatives from different countries to reduce their emissions. Okay, this is just a map of the 24 states that have either executive or legislative targets to reduce executive or legislative economy-wide targets to reduce their GHG emissions. Okay, so now let's go to the potential explanations for this big struggle, this inability so far to really get a national policy framework implemented, in particular to get legislation adopted. How could we explain this struggle? Which was the original motivating question for this presentation. Okay, so I think if asked, many people would say, well, or people who, that it's a product of political polarization. And of course, this climate change is not the only issue on which there's tremendous political polarization in the country, right? Many people would say it's really the product of intense opposition within the Republican Party to addressing climate change. And of course, there is some evidence for this political polarization explanation. So this is from a Times Siena poll of Biden and Trump voters, which, tells us what probably a lot of us know intuitively or think intuitively, that Biden voters were way more concerned about their climate change than Trump voters were. Okay, so this you can see is sort of a proxy for illustrating the degree of political polarization on climate change. Okay, now there's countervailing data as well, suggesting even though there's polarization, there's a lot of recognition, across the country that climate change is happening. Okay. And then, this data, this slide and the last slide, they really come from the Yale School, Yale's program on communications and climate change. And, this is sort of an interesting slide that kind of emphasizes, well, sort of countervailing slide emphasizing, well, yeah, maybe there's a lot of recognition, but are people willing to recognize human role? This slide suggests there are a lot of areas in the country, again, consistent with the polarization hypothesis, that aren't willing to recognize the human contribution. Okay, now I think this is kind of an interesting slide, especially in light of the last one. So here the question that they were asking was, again, a lot of this is coming from Yale's program on communications on climate change. Here the question is, would you support taxing fossil fuel companies if the proceeds were basically used to reduce other taxes? So this is kind of not, this is a question testing people's interest in actually, one potential policy response. And notwithstanding the sort of results of the previous slide, I think this slide is interesting because it suggests a lot of people, including, it must be said, at least some Republicans seem to be supporting the idea of a tax, at least if some of the proceeds would go to reducing other taxes. So here you see 66% of those polled basically supporting the idea of taxing fossil fuel companies and using the proceeds to reduce other taxes. So this is, does suggest some, willingness across, including some people in the Republican side, to actually take measures to address climate change. So again, that sort of begs the question, well, yes, there's political polarization, but is that fully explaining the difficulty at the federal level. Okay, given that there seems to be some willingness to introduce a policy, some kind of policy measure. Okay, so this takes me to the work of UC Santa Barbara political scientist, Professor Mildenberger. So in this interesting book, Carbon Captured, published in 2020, he basically argues, well, you should see the difficulty that the US and other countries, his book looks at climate policy in the US, Australia, Norway. You should see this difficulty of adopting climate policy as a reflection, not just of political opposition on one side of the political divide, but as a reflection of opposition kind of on both sides of the political divide. Okay, hence his double representation, what he calls his double representation hypothesis. So, one sort of implication of what he's saying is that we shouldn't see Senator Joe Manchin as a historical aberration. That actually, what Mildenberger is saying is that there's sort of there's been consistent within the US, but also in other countries, consistently opposition across the political divide. And that's really complicated adopting a comprehensive climate policy. Okay, so what are Mildenberger's arguments? Well, he starts from the idea that climate policy is fundamentally redistributive. Okay, so basically, reducing those greenhouse gas emissions from those 5 sectors involves, shifting away from fossil fuels. Okay, so we need to stop buying gasoline powered cars. We need to heat our buildings with, electricity generated from renewables rather than gas. And we need to stop buying gas stoves. So these vast societal changes, they're going to be winners and losers, right? The people selling the gas stoves are going to be selling fewer gas stoves. So he really emphasizes we have to think about climate policy as redistributive. Okay. His second point is that, because it's redistributive and redistributive on such a large scale, there are people on all sides of the political spectrum who see themselves as really threatened by these big changes. Okay, and this is true not only in the US but internationally. Okay, now his third point, which sort of goes to, well, why has the US in particular struggled? Is that, well, the US political system, as many political scientists would say this, the US political system has many veto points that opponents can use to block change. Okay, so it has widely seen as having many more veto points that can be used to block change than other Western democracies. Okay, so what are some examples of those veto points? Well, the filibuster rule in the Senate, the bicameralism itself is a veto point that you need support from both 2 houses of the legislature. And then you have the filibuster rule in the Senate. Then you have the court can also potentially be a veto point. Well, the court opened up the regulatory strategy, which, the Obama administration tried to use. It can also close down the regulatory strategy, as it did in 2016 when it stayed the Clean Power Plan, and as it may do in West Virginia EPA. So the court itself can be seen as a veto point. Okay, the executive branch can be a veto point, depending on which party is in power. So the point here is that there are a lot of veto points, okay, in the US political system, very well understood. Okay, point. But this has to be seen as one of the things blocking climate change policy. Okay, now I'm going to talk about maybe some of the implications for how you might move forward if you adopt Mildenberger's double representation hypothesis. But before we get to those potential ways of moving forward if you adopt that hypothesis, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on this point about the court potentially being used as a veto point. Okay, and you can see this in West Virginia versus EPA very starkly, right? And so here I had a fellow here kind of pull for me, well, what are the states suing, and who's the governor of the states is kind of as a proxy for the political composition of the plaintiffs in the case. Okay, and so basically, except for 2 of the states, they all have Republican governors. And again, except for 2 of the states, they all have GHG emissions that are above the national average. Okay, so essentially what you're seeing here is, a group of people who perceive themselves likely, or the way I would understand it, is people who perceive themselves as threatened, or jurisdictions that perceive themselves as threatened by climate policy, kind of using the court as a veto point. Okay. Now, in addition to this double representation veto point hypothesis, okay, you could have other explanations for why the U.S. has struggled. I don't mean to suggest that one in particular is the only one. It's just one that I've kind of been reading about and thinking a bit about. Okay, another explanation might be the low salience of climate change, except in particular moments, when there's some kind of natural evidence of climate change, like very damaging hurricanes or wildfires or droughts. Okay, but generally speaking, maybe might see this as a kind of low salience issue. Okay, another kind of theory might relate to the state of technology, right? That maybe technology is not sufficiently advanced yet that for people to see addressing climate change as as within the realm of the feasible. Okay. And so maybe we need some more advances in technology. We need, even further dissemination of renewables. We need kind of even further dissemination of electric vehicles before people will see this, mitigation as really kind of politically something that could feasibly be done. Okay, and in that light, it's interesting to look at kind of how electric vehicle sales really, although still a very small proportion of new car sales in the US, really have risen dramatically in the past few years. So you might hypothesize that once electric vehicle sales account for, maybe it's going to be 5, maybe 10% of new car sales in the US, maybe there'll be reach some tipping point where people start to perceive this as kind of a change that actually can be made. Okay, and that will make it actually in turn easier to address this change, to address the policy challenge. Okay, so here I'm just offering, different hypotheses. One could offer many others, and I actually am curious what people's reactions are to these different hypotheses. Okay, so now let me just very briefly conclude by kind of talking about, well, okay, I've laid out, what might be some strategies for trying to advance the ball, and with the hopes that eventually we'll be able to develop kind of at the national level, or kind of a 5-sector strategy for reducing GHG emissions that will have some staying power that at the national level. Okay, so what might be some strategies for doing this? So here I'm kind of influenced again by Mildinger's double representation hypothesis, which emphasizes not only which emphasizes opposition across the political spectrum. Okay, and okay, so one of the things that he suggests, and I guess other political scientists also have suggested this, is that you have to see climate politics as something that's kind of iterative, not a one-shot thing, but something that climate policy is something that will to be achieved and revisited over time. Okay, so it's incremental policy developments. Okay, and so what you have to think about through the policy is kind of broadening the coalitions. Okay, and so if you take that perspective that you want, what you want to do through climate policy, again, which would be sort of a staged thing, but over time to broaden the coalitions, and not just broaden the coalitions to encompass people who we think of as Republicans, but also to bring in more Democrats. So just broaden the coalitions generally. What you want to do is create policies in which a lot of people will feel that they have something to win, okay, from this policy. Okay, and so in that light, I think that there's kind of very sort of interesting strategy that you've seen sort of develop. Initially, it was developed at the state level in California and then in New York, which then kind of got exported to the Fed, which was adopted at the federal level, which is this idea that you guarantee that a certain percent of the benefits of climate policy, okay, will accrue to disadvantaged communities. Okay, so in New York State, the idea was that disadvantaged communities will get at least 35% of the benefits of spending on clean energy under the New York State climate law. The goal would be 40%, and then this idea got adopted at the federal level, okay, and under the Justice 40 initiative, which is the idea that vulnerable communities will receive at least 40% of the benefits of climate energy investments, okay? So I think this is a very interesting, potentially powerful idea, which relies very heavily, obviously, on who do you identify as the disadvantaged communities or the vulnerable communities? If you identify the disadvantaged or the vulnerable communities in certain ways, then you can potentially really expand the coalitions who might support climate change policy, because they might see themselves as standing really to benefit from climate change policy, okay? So I think an interesting area of focus going forward will be to look at what are the characteristics of the communities that are being mapped as disadvantaged communities and vulnerable communities, and are those communities that are being mapped for benefits, is that going to not only help adjust, you know, historical injustices in the environmental realm, but is that going to also help widen the constituencies to support climate change policy? Okay. Then a second strategy that I'll just sort of highlight that, you know, may be helpful over time in kind of broadening the coalition supporting climate change policy is additional policies at the state and the local level. And here I'm not saying anything not particularly novel, but I guess what I want to emphasize is that when you think about local policies and state level policies, so local policies say to reduce emissions of GHGs from buildings, or state level policies to commit to introducing renewable, or to commit to ever expanding amounts of renewables in the power sector, okay? Yes, those policies are achieving concrete policy goals, but they're also doing something else, which is they're sort of normalizing the idea that climate change is actually an issue that can be addressed, okay? And so there's a kind of normalization function that I think over time, the more people, maybe this optimistic part of me thinks, well, maybe these policies have a role not only in actually reducing GHG emissions, but in normalizing the idea of moving away from fossil fuels, okay? And so we have to think about these local and state level policies in different ways, not just as concrete policy tools, but also as, sort of constructing this, this coalition that's necessary to eventually, hopefully enact a federal policy framework. Okay, so I'm almost at the end here of my presentation, but I just wanted to, just to add a slide here about the war in Ukraine. So, up until this point, I've talked about climate change policy is primarily kind of domestic, a policy that needs to be structured in domestic policy terms. But of course, there's this whole national security dimension to climate change policy, which has been well recognized for a long time, but which I think is vividly on display in the war in Ukraine. It'll be interesting to see, I think, how, what will be the effects of the war in Ukraine on climate change policy in the EU, but also in the US. Because here we're seeing a conflict in which, the aggressor here, they're basically, their capacity to wage this war is basically dependent on the fossil fuel industry. Okay, so it's not a fight over access to resources that are newly valuable because of climate change. It's a fight that's basically financed by fossil fuels. Okay, so I think that there's kind of an interesting question about what will the long-term consequences of this war, how will that affect climate policy? Okay, it could affect it in negative ways as US maybe increases production to offset the removal of some Russian sales of oil and gas. But maybe it could also have a positive impact. This, of course, remains to be determined. So with that, I'm going to stop talking now, and I very much look forward to hearing people's reactions and comments and questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Maybe if you could stop share of your screen, and then I'll open it up and we can have a discussion. I actually have a question. I know my colleague, Professor Flatt, has a question as well. And so, and then here we go. Here's our CLE information for those of you who need that. So go ahead and take a screenshot of that and be able to use that. Okay, so I think that I'm super fascinated by this concept of that it's the political nature of it, and how there's the split in the political sections themselves as well. This whole double representation hypothesis, I think, is interesting. And I also think that I like that that you think that there's some promising efforts with regard to the environmental justice information that's going on. I worry, and I'm going to throw this out as a question, a statement question, and see what you think. I worry that the environmental justice movements that we're seeing, where we're requiring like 40% or 35% or whatever it is to go back to disadvantaged communities, whether that will actually create even more polarization, because it could be seen as a redistribution of wealth by people who are already predisposed to believe that to begin with. And I wonder if that will have almost an opposite type of reaction, and maybe not have the political support that, because the communities who would be receiving that benefit are probably communities that already would support it to a degree anyway. And so I'm just curious what you think about that.
I mean, I think that is definitely a potential risk. Okay, I don't want to be naive here. That is a political risk. Okay, I think it depends a lot on which communities are designated as vulnerable communities and disadvantaged communities. And I haven't done a comprehensive analysis of this, but I was looking at New York State's map, or I think it's probably just a draft map, and right now of the communities that would be the recipients of these benefits. And it's not just urban areas. It's also, I happen to know something a bit about upstate New York, because I go there sometimes in the summer and stuff. And it's also areas, some of these areas are also traditionally Republican areas. So I think it really depends on the criteria that are used, okay, to map communities. And but there is a risk, as you're saying, that these efforts, could lead to a reaction. I think it depends.
I think that's super fascinating to see who would be included in the disadvantaged communities.
I think that will be an interesting project, I think, for scholars to see actually who's included, and also how the various maps compare, because now we will have, like in New York State, we'll have a state map, and there's also potential to use the federal screening tool also to compare that map to the state map.
Yeah. Okay, so if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or and I have a couple, or you can raise your hand and ask a question. I'm going to ask Professor Flatt. You had a question.
Thank you. So Professor Wyman, again, thank you so much for this. I love this. I love
Katrina.
And I, in particular, I think, I looked at all this legislative stuff much, much longer when they were trying to form it. And since then, of course, I have sort of focused more on the political answer, right? It's a political, the US has a different, blah, 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 blah. But I love this because it really expands and gives intricacy to a lot of this map and political reasons. And something hit me that I've thought about it, but it really crystallized when you were presenting this, particularly when you were talking about the examples between the United States, Australia, and Norway. So one of the thing those
It's
three-
from Mildinger, by the way. That's not original.
Yeah, well, but you highlighted it, right? And you
Yeah.
went from there, and that, you know, of course, they all have in common that they get a fairly large amount of their GDP and jobs, et cetera, and part of their even culture from fossil fuels. And what it makes me wonder if the real distinction is actually, I mean, you were talking around the edges of it with environmental justice and disadvantaged communities, but is perhaps even the bigger issue one of income inequality?
Mm-hmm.
So that if people don't have jobs, if they don't have health insurance, if they don't have all of these other things, there's much more of a need to hold on to what we think of as economic growth or development or less economic displacement. And what hit me about the Australia, Norway, US model is you sort of have three different examples of that at three different stages, right? So Norway has much less income inequality, and they do seem to have been shifting, right, to what they're thinking about the future, producing less oil, investing in renewables, and they seem to have more of a cohesiveness around that. Australia is sort of in the middle, and has a different political system. So in theory, we have a test, right? With the new government in Australia, is it all going to switch, or, you know, is it not? So how much of this, I mean, and I guess the question I'm asking is, can we really solve this problem in the US if it's based on this just incredible income inequality that exists in our country?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess, you know, my intuition would be, well, if you have a lot of income inequality and a lot of people who feel very vulnerable, okay, and it's going to be hard to introduce have a very vast systemic change like getting rid of fossil fuels entails, because there are going to be a lot of vulnerable people who just are not so resilient to the change, right? It's harder to deal with the change when you have less to begin with, okay, and you're going to perceive yourself as more threatened. So I do think that there probably is a link between the ability of a society to engage in this sort of massive change that is, you know, removing fossil fuels entails, and, you know, the resilience of the society, which is likely related to income inequality. And I guess that, you know, was part of the instinct, the political intuition, right, behind the Green New Deal and behind Build Back Better and stuff as well. That's the same political instinct. But then, you know, to Professor Warren's point, you know, that there can be a reaction to trying to, you know, engage in redistribution as a way of solving the climate problem. So, and that strategy has not so far really worked, right? So, you know, I think part of the reason also that I'm interested in talking about the US struggle now and the causes of it is because I think, you know, if this strategy has not worked, and it's, you know, it's not the end of the day yet, but we might have to start thinking about another strategy going forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
And so in the chat, so Aber has a question for you. I thought it was really interesting. I had never really considered that the majority of our regulatory nature of greenhouse gases, the greenhouse gas laws are mostly coming through regulation instead of legislation, which makes a lot of sense in thinking about that. So when we frame it that way, I think Aber was questioning, you know, when you have the government, how can the federal government contribute to climate justice when the chances of integrated climate policy are tied to the fate of administrations that change every 4 or 8 years? And so it's not just the veto issue too. I mean, or maybe this is an additional veto issue. This undoubtedly poses a problem of legal certainty.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge challenge, you know? And I think that's one reason also that you can see the EU as having been much more successful than the US, because it's been able to basically adopt a framework it's been able to maintain frameworks over time and enhance those frameworks over time. Okay. And I guess I also question, how successful the US can be at the federal level until you actually get legislation. Until then, it's kind of triage, and there's a lot of risks to the triage, and I'm not sure how much that triage strategy will, how much the regulatory strategy will be able to be maintained given the changes in the composition of the court. Because it was really the court that opened up the potential for that regulatory strategy in 2007. And now I guess we're seeing, is the court going to gradually kind of close the doors to using the regulatory strategy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. We have another question in the chat box. So from Ira Feldman, in your first slide, you made it clear that you were putting adaptation off to the side, but doesn't comprehensive climate legislation at this point in time necessarily include both mitigation and adaptation? Does it make sense to ignore half of the climate discourse as we consider comprehensive legislation?
That's totally great point. I totally agree. And I actually think, again, going back to my work at the local level, which has been the focus of my interests in the past few years, has really been at the potential to advance climate policy at the local level. And I do feel that at the local level, there's been a lot of, at least, rhetoric about mitigating climate change and adaptation. But I do think that at the local level, the big challenge going forward truly is going to be adapting to climate change, because there's not that much power that these cities can have, and they can do things to reduce emissions, but they can't have that much impact in the long run. But they really will have to adapt if they're going to maintain their presence as cities over time, some of these coastal cities in particular. So I think that over time, adaptation is going to become a preeminent issue. I think that and there's going to be a need. Right now, we've talked about, and I've been talking about, mitigation and adaptation as distinct projects, but I think the next challenge is actually going to be blending the mitigation and the adaptation strategies at the local level, but then also at the national level, that we're going to have to stop thinking about these as two buckets, but actually develop, an integrated approach. Because, there's only going to be just, thinking about the regulation of buildings, which is, something that I've been thinking about with my colleague Danielle Spiegelfeld recently. We've been, there have been a number of cities in the US, including New York and Boston, that have, passed legislation that cap the greenhouse gas emissions of large buildings. But in these cities, you're not just going to have to, cap the greenhouse gas emissions. You're going to have to make a lot of these buildings more resilient to flooding or to extreme heat. And so you have to start thinking about, well, how can you incentivize the building owners to do both? Okay. And so that's just a small example of how I think there's a conceptual challenge, I think, going forward that needs to be addressed of, well, we have to actually give much more attention to adaptation, but also merge our considerations of adaptation and mitigation. So we're incentivizing both.
Yeah, that brings up one of the thoughts I had when you were talking about this 5-sector strategy, which is great to think about, but I was also considering that some of that, because of our cooperative federalism or federalism model, some of the things like buildings, I mean, that's regulated generally at the state or local level, building codes and things like that. And thinking about what that means for trying to have a federal comprehensive plan over things that might be regulated generally at the state level or local level.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally a fair point as well. That, we might see more of a federal role in some of these sectors than others. Okay. And buildings might be one of the sectors where you have less of a federal role. It's interesting in the building sector, now and under the Biden administration, they have in the Council on Environmental Quality somebody whose responsibility includes buildings. reducing GHG emissions from buildings. And he used to work at the local level. He was the head of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in New York. So what that office has done, what CEQ's done in the Biden administration, is they've helped to form this sort of coalition of states and cities that are interested in developing building performance standards, either to regulate greenhouse gas emissions or increase energy efficiency from buildings. So, and EPA is kind of doing some work to sort of highlight kind of best practices and to help local governments and states weigh the trade-offs involved in, developing different forms of building regulation. So that could be a sector, the building sector could be a sector where maybe the federal government doesn't come in and actually, establish the standards, but it provides kind of a lot of research and support, maybe even a model law. I hesitate to invoke the history of zoning, but that there was, like a model federal, the federal government did spur the development of the spread of zoning, obviously a very fraught practice these days, but it did help to spur that. And you could see the federal government doing a similar role, a similar thing in the buildings case, right? Developing a kind of model law and then and helping local governments or states adopt it.
All right. Okay, Albert, you want me to hand it over to you?
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Katrina, for your great presentation. I have another question. Do you think that at some point the Biden administration will be undermining its own climate efforts, since it has now to ask to Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates to increase their oil and gas production, and it might have to ask to US national companies to increase oil and gas production. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's counter to the effort to get off fossil fuels, isn't it? But on the other hand, they're really in a tough political situation. I mean, yes, they really could undermine climate. That's a risk in this whole geopolitical situation that we're in now. There is a serious risk that, efforts to address climate change could be undermined as countries, become even more economically embedded in the fossil fuel industry in response to the need to ramp up, or the perceived need to ramp up production. I mean, that's a huge risk. It's a tough situation though.
All right. Any other questions?